I'm Jeannie Rude. I'm an agronomist at Pro Co-op, so I work in Sheridan County, Montana, and a little bit to the south and west of that as well. My responsibilities are everything from herbicide, fungicide, grasshoppers, and then I also work with our fertility program. I'm kind of the lead with our precision program, so I'm thinking of new ways to be more accurate with what we do. And so like all agronomists, I wear a lot of hats. But yeah, that's maybe a short summary. I've been at Pro Co-op for 7 seasons.
Okay, I'm Sarah Erickson, and I grew up in Williston. Just moved back here a year ago. I work at Horizon Resources. That got really loud. I am, let's see, what I do there and why. I started agronomy in like the soil lab, so I really like soil sampling. And then went to work for a private consulting company, so I love doing private consulting type stuff. I like to be out scouting fields and, you know, making recs, that type of thing. And that's kind of what I do in at Horizons. I keep our farm program that we have, our record keeping program, up to date. I like precision ag. I basically do everything that the guys don't want to do. I leave them to do the selling stuff.
My name is Jack Piper. I work for Vision Research Park in Berthold, North Dakota. I am our precision agronomist there, and just like these other two ladies, I've worn a few hats over the last few years. Up to this point, I worked very closely with our small plot research team out of Berthold, and we basically do our own independent consulting and research on varieties, inputs, whether it be varieties or fungicides, anything you can think of. So I've been very closely involved in that, and right now basically I'm running our precision ag program where we're doing prescription fertility for growers across the region. And that covers right now from Bottineau all the way in, or Bottineau County all the way into Williams County, and then down to Lake Sakakawea.
One more quick question. Why did each one of you decide you wanted to be an agronomist?
I guess I kind of came into this, I grew up on a farm. My mom was the farmer, and so I've never considered doing anything but agriculture. I've worked in the industry. A lot of you probably recognize me. I used to work for Syngenta and did a lot of meetings back then. But when it came down to it, I love working now as a retail agronomist. Every day I come to work and solve real problems for real people. And there's probably no greater satisfaction for me than listening to my growers talk about what they're doing and what their goals are and figuring out how to make sure that they can achieve that.
Okay, this is easy. I bought a saddle and I needed to pay for it. I barrel race, and I just, like I said, bought a saddle, started working in Ag Vice to pay off the saddle, worked there for years, and like as a lab tech, loved being in the lab, had lots of questions, went to work for a private consulting company as a tech, and did scouting, soil sampling, basically everything that they do, and just kind of have built myself up over the years through that. Found out that I really love agronomy. I'm competitive, so I love my growers to be like, I want their yields to be better than their neighbors. So I'm kind of like that. That's kind of how I go with it. So that was how I ended up in agronomy.
So I ended up in agronomy almost completely by accident. Not a farm kid. I think about 10 or 11 years ago, I met my former boss who was running United Agronomy in Berthold. And he kept asking me if I had any interest in agronomy, and I did not have any idea about agronomy. After a few attempts, he managed to hire me. And where I started just basically on the operations side of our ag business, and then I transitioned into a sales agronomist. From there, I got really, really interested in helping growers in our area, and it was really, really enjoyable. Kind of for the same reasons that you guys were alluding to, seeing your growers do better than their neighbors, something as simple as that, or just seeing things work. And that's kind of what transitioned into me getting involved with small plot research, because that was a great way for me to really see what was working and what is the best solution for each grower. From there, I really wanted to get involved in precision agriculture, because I always thought that was going to, and I still do think that's going to be the way of the future. And that's what has landed me here today with all of you.
Apologize for having to pass this back and forth. This is the one that works. So anyway, with that in mind, we're always looking to find a little bit of a bright spot in our operations and unexpected pleasure. What have you seen the last couple of years here that said, wow, that kind of worked out pretty well for those guys? And maybe on the opposite side is, God, that looked like it was going to be so good, but it just didn't do what it advertised.
I think something we've really gotten right the last couple of years was, I don't know how many grasshoppers you guys are dealing with, but for us, it's feeling a little biblical right now. And so as we manage the plague, we've definitely found what worked better. When we start, like, all of you had experience maybe, or many of you, with grasshoppers in the 80s, but all of those products aren't on the market anymore. Most of them aren't. And so starting over again, there's very little information in the larger industry on grasshoppers because it's such a transitory problem. It's a problem for a few years, and just about the time you get started figuring stuff out, I hope we don't have to deal with it again for another 20, 30 years. And so, man, that first year in 21, learning about grasshoppers, that felt like a lot of learning on the ground at a lot of people's expense. It was really nice to come in 22 with a better idea of which products we use when and where, which crops, how we manage that. Charlie was talking earlier when he did his thing about the softfly parasitoids, and we know about all the different products, and we're starting to think about the consequences inside the larger ecology. And that's been something that's, if there's an upside to grasshoppers, at least we're learning how to kill them better.
All right, I guess I'm gonna pass on this one a little bit, because last year was my first year up here, and what I've noticed from moving from the east side of the state to the southwest side of the state to up here, everybody is different, and last year was my learning year as to what crops everybody's growing up here, chemistry, fertility. So I'm gonna go with, I was just a newbie and I don't really know what worked and what didn't, but I do know that I'm very upset that we didn't use Valor down in the southwest part of the state, but our soils are a little bit too different to be able to use that. It ruins any rotation that we need.
I can think of a couple, but one was really interesting to me, and something that was kind of new, and that was variable rating seed, and it was in wheat, and we discovered we had a couple different varieties that were, one was a very offensive variety of wheat, where good ground and high management is going to do well, and another variety that seemed to really kind of, raise the floor, so to speak. And see, I had a grower further east of here, but he had a couple really interesting fields that had a lot of different soil types and just a lot of variability. And I had shot him the idea of variable rating the seed between those kind of different management zones, and it actually produced a much better yield across that field than he'd ever expected, and it actually worked, which was really cool to me. So I think just a bright spot, there's a lot of really cool things to try kind of in the similar vein, but I think we just need to get creative in what we try, because I think there's a lot of solutions.
You would ask also about what didn't work that I thought would work. And one of the things, so we've been playing with variable rate fertility quite a bit, both nitrogen or mid-row type programs and then also starter. And last year we had pretty cold start to the spring, not exactly wet. And we certainly found the bottom of where we needed to be with phosphorus on some of that. And those aren't things you want to find, but on the other hand, it's good to know where it is. Turns out that wasn't enough, and it was barley, which is particularly sensitive in cold soils, so that worked out not ideal, but we did find where the bottom of that should be with some of the variable rate work we do. There's not clear parameters, seeding rate, starter, there's not clear parameters. Nobody tells us where we should be at the top and bottom. And so sometimes you find those numbers, sometimes you find them on purpose and sometimes you find them on accident.
So one of my first experiences with variable rate is I tried phosphorus on my peas. That did not work very well. My field looked like a pinto pony. There were so many different ripening zones that it once was enough to try that. So, but sounds like, I don't know, a little unofficial poll, how many people are doing variable rate? So quite a few. How many are thinking about maybe getting into variable rate? I'm wondering if you could describe what could be a logical on-ramp for somebody who has not quite done it yet, but who would like to move in that direction.
I'll let you start this one.
So let me think about this. So probably the first question you have to ask are kind of the first barrier are equipment limitations. From there, you just need to know basically whether your equipment as is can variable rate. And you might be surprised what you already have might be able to do it already. I don't know. From there, you're going to be able to reach out to whoever your local precision agronomist may be, probably at your local retailer. From there, hopefully somebody can make you some zone maps, and there are a number of ways in that which that can be done. And in some instances, or a lot probably with some of these local retailers, they would be able to apply nitrogen or like a canola blend of nitrogen and AMS through a spreader and variable rate it. So you may not even have to have the seeding equipment for it. That might be one of the first avenues to take. Other than that, I guess I was talking to Brian about this before we got up here. But how many growers currently using a variable rate program or taking advantage of any of the USDA or NRCS programs to assist with that? Any poll of hands? Any of you? One of you, two of you, maybe? But that's something I would encourage you all to look into, because I think it's going to be something that will be further incentivized down the road and something that will make it easier to get in.
On that note, one thing about getting into those programs is it costs money, just so you know that. They give you money, but for us to build the variable rate maps costs us money, so you will get charged more for it than if you just do a conventional soil sample, which is a shock to some people. I mean, especially if you do go with a private company where they probably add other services in there with it too. But just know that it will cost you a little bit more than just a conventional soil sample.
I think the growers I work with that have started variable rate, it's easy to start with nitrogen because we all know there's better and worse parts of the field, and that's, a lot of guys do start with spreaders that I work with. They have us spreading or someone spreading, and they want that prescription that can just go through the spreader. In the past, there was a lot of talk about using your yield data to create those maps, and we were talking ahead of time. And I think many of you have found out that your yield data is not probably the tool to create the map. It's a good way to truth the map. It's a good way to check what you're doing. But when I was in school, we were going to do it all with yield data. There was a lot of talk in the industry in the 2015 to 2020 on how all this yield data was going to come from your combines through John Deere Case software, and it was going to magically create these fertility maps for you. And it just doesn't work like that. There's a combine and a combine operator, and bless their hearts, they just make mistakes. So having somebody that can work with another layer to bring into your yield data, a lot of guys came to me when they were talking about it, and they're like, well, I don't have good yield data. And we're used to that. I mean, we know you don't have good yield data. I work with people that have been collecting it for 25 years, and they have maybe 3 good years for a field. And so that seems to be in a lot of people's minds. If you don't have good yield data or any yield data, that's a stopping point. But I would say that should never hold you back, because we have the ability to use imagery and other tools now to get good layers without that yield data that measure your fields pretty accurately. So nitrogen is always an easy starting point. Jack and I were talking beforehand. Both of us are playing with seeding rate on different crops. My goal this year is to do some fungicide. Like, I didn't last year, but it better rain this year, because I have a plan and I'm going to do some fungicide. And I think there's some real opportunity there I'm pretty excited about.
So we got any questions from the audience? So we got a little bit of chatter going about variable rate. And we got pretty good acoustics here. We don't have another mic, but if you want to stand up and belt it out, I'd love to have a little bit of help. These are just a few questions I put together when I found out that I got to be a facilitator of this. Oh, okay. So, well, let's take the first question you put together for yourselves.
So Sarah was on it, and when we realized we were going to be on the panel together, she had emailed, and we kind of came up with a list of things we thought would be interesting to talk about. And so one of our list was like, so we've all done a lot of soil sampling this fall, all 3 of us. And so we were talking about what are some things we've seen this fall in our businesses, and we're pretty separated geographically. I'm in Montana, and these guys are in different places in North Dakota. So in our geographies, what have we seen this fall that has kind of been interesting or unique?
So for me, I thought the biggest difference for soil sampling was the nitrogen levels here. I had been down in southwest North Dakota for the past 5 years, and our levels were usually, we had lower in the topsoil and a lot in the subsoil. Here, there's nothing. And I was like, whoa, this is new. So this is where I feel like some of the precision application of fertilizer, especially nitrogen, will be beneficial. And I guess one of the other things, and this wasn't a soil sampling thing, but this was just a thing that I found this spring as unusual. Down south, when we're doing a starter for wheat, durum, whatever, we did a lot of phosphorus with potassium mixed in. And that wasn't a thing up here, which kind of blew me away, because I was like, our soils aren't that different, and it could be beneficial to get some of that potassium in with the seed closer.
That's an interesting note with potassium, because I think it's something that, like, if any of you have taken a hard look at your soil test results, probably in this area, especially going further east, it's been largely a non-issue. We've had I'd say a lot of tests, like over 500 parts per million, and on the low side. Right. Yes, and I think she brings up a really interesting point, because I think it does need to be something that needs to be looked at, and possibly doing some applications of that where we're seeing those numbers fall, especially across kind of the geography that I've soil sampled in, like I mentioned, from Bottineau County all the way through Williams County and further south. By and large, it seemed like this fall a lot of nitrogen was used. I mean, there's across the region, I think I've averaged maybe 16 pounds in the topsoil and 22 to 23 in the 6 to 24 inch profile, which is good. I think we had good yields across the region, but that's kind of the trend one of the trends I noticed this year.
So in Montana, we had the haves who got rain and the haves-nots who did not get rain this year. And it's been interesting. So part of my geography very much see those kind of soil tests where there's just, I mean, we're down to less than 15 pounds in the whole sample. That crop used that nitrogen, which is unfortunate because it's still expensive and now you have to go buy some. But I've also seen samples that were just a little bit further west and you could tell where a crop was shallow rooted, so it used the surface nitrogen, but there's quite a bit down lower, or just in general more nitrogen than I'd like to see at the end of a season. Certainly tells me the drought has affected that crop, did not use what was there. In our email, we had also talked about phosphorus. As I've gone through and looked at my soil samples this fall and over the last few years, I'm seeing some phosphorus availabilities change, and it's actually getting higher. Their soil test is telling me there's more phosphorus available in the soil. And certainly, in a lot of cases, growers have invested heavily in a phosphorus program, right? You guys have heard the spiel. You can choose to replace the phosphorus you take off, or you can choose to be involved in a more maintenance type program. At $900 phosphorus, I'm guessing you're not doing the maintenance program right now, but you were when it was a little bit less expensive. And so it seems like, you know, maybe it's drought. We talked about some of that, and I'll let Jack give his perspective. The other thing I'm seeing is I'm starting to see, so where I'm at is 100% no-till, no disturbance. And we're definitely starting to see that stratification in pH from the subsoils up to the surface soils. And as we see that, I think that's also impacting the soil test phosphorus availability. The real question is, does the crop experience that more available phosphorus, or is it showing up on the soil test, but it's not actually plant available? And that's a question I'm pursuing. That phosphorus change has been happening for a few years now, and it's becoming now to where if you were to compare these samples to samples from 5 years ago, you would think that we had bought a lot of phosphorus fertilizer, and I don't think we've bought that much.
I could say we're seeing probably the same thing, where it seems like a lot of our, I mean, probably 4 years ago, like every soil test we'd see was low or very low, and a lot of our growers have been on kind of that same building to maintaining program, and I mean we're seeing some high areas, but we're kind of in a mixed. We're mainly no-till, but there's a mix across the acres we see. And I'm not quite sure what it means yet, but we will try to find out.
I'm going to pass on that one.
So Brian was asking us about soil acidity and if we're starting to see some trends there. And I can answer, I certainly am. It's not a lot of samples. It's maybe 5% of my total, call it 600 samples we do as a company at Pro Co-op. But for those 5% of the samples, it's pretty significant. And it's at a point where I've actually spent quite a bit of time in January doing research on lime applications, which I never thought I would do a few years ago. I'm not ready to spread lime yet, but I think that we need to get closer to that in my trade area. And so what's it mean? Like, I think one of the things that always confuses me when we hear presentations is what is a low pH or a high pH? And at least where I work, I would say our parent materials is that like 8.0 to 8.2. Maybe there's some 7/8s, but there's also some 8.4s in that 6-inch and under pH. So my top 6-inch pH anymore, I question it when it's the same as this 6 to 24. So anytime it's the same, I'm starting to wonder what the guy, like, did we get a bad sample? Is this saline? What's going on? So I usually expect to see maybe a 0.5 point difference between my subsoil and my surface soil. So if my subsoil is an 8.2, I'm expecting my surface pH to be like a 7.8-ish. So if it's in that ballpark, I'm not worried about it. Once they get down to where they're in the low 7s, it's worth remembering. And once they get into the 6s, that's where I start wanting, so this is on a whole field, right? Like, most of my growers aren't doing zone tests. I do quite a bit, but it's not everybody. So on a whole field basis, if you're starting to see samples that are coming in the 6s in the top 6-inch, on a pH 8 parent material. That's a huge stratification now. And when you think about what you're getting in that soil sample that represents a whole field, that means somewhere in that field, there's way less than a 6. Because that composite sample represents 10 to 15 points, right? So where did that point come from? And so that's where I want to start playing with some more zone testing, and I would encourage guys who are starting to see that stratification, it's time to start looking at zones, because once you pull it into zones, and I think these guys will agree, as soon as you pull it into zones, now it's not a 1 point difference, it's like a 2.5 point difference between the high zones in your field and the low pH zones in your field. So we're doing the research on how to get lime to Northeast Montana in an economic fashion, which if someone has the answer to that question, I am all ears. But if it's in the 5s, I think we need to start in a zone in the 5s. That's where I feel like we need to start looking at remediation. I'm not ready to go there yet on any kind of scale, but that's what I'm starting to see. Some of those soils that are in 5s, though, they started at a 7, right? They were a unique soil. Maybe they were sandy. Maybe they're south of Peerless and they're just weird. But those soils started off lower as well. But at the same time, a pH 5 is going to be detrimental to our crops. It's not the whole rooting zone, right? In zero till, it's this top, like we're doing 6-inch samples, then we'll pull 2-inch samples. My intern's going to get to do lots of 2-inch samples this summer. Because part of the question I think I have is how deep that pH change is in the soil. That's some stuff that I've been pondering, but I'll let these guys talk about their market.
So I was just at a meeting a couple weeks ago down in Fargo, and the extension agent from down in Dickinson has been doing a lot of research on pH and acidity, because in that part of the state, we are getting a lot of really low pHs showing up because of long-term no-till. Some of the area, like the area that I was working in south of Beach, they were one of the first areas in the state that took up no-till, and the residue that they have on their fields is kind of part of the issue also. It's trapping chemicals and fertilizer and stuff in there and not allowing things to leach down, and so you're getting those top 2 inches really acidic. Same issue of trying to figure out how to get lime if they're gonna do that, or if there's possibly ways that they can go in and do some kind of cultivation to open it up a little bit to get it to drain a little better. But that is something that I'm gonna be very aware of this year when I'm out sampling, and that is one of the reasons I like zone sampling, is we can find those problem areas a little bit easier than if you just do a composite.
I think that might be a great conversation to have with some of the research pathologists. It's not something I know that I'm involved in at all.
I did just see an article about that, but I don't think I read it. I just kind of saw it and skimmed it and went, interesting, that should be something I should read.
That's interesting. I'm not aware of any work that anybody in our companies or research companies done on that yet, but it's a good topic we could look into for sure. Back to the question of acidity. I think just this whole conversation going down the line, it just screams zone sampling, because you're not going to isolate these areas of the field where you're going to have problems by composite sample unless you're going to log your or GPS reference all of your composite sample sites which may or may not happen. I'm not aware of anybody else that does that, but if you're going to do that, you might as well be zone sampling already. And it's just one step to get to know each of your fields that much better, and actually be able to address a problem that you may have. So Jeannie just asked how many zones we have and how many zones we sample. Right now, we typically break everything into 6 zones. So it's like a dark green, light yellow, yellow, orange, red. And of those we sample, we group two zones together. So light green, dark green get zoned together, or sampled together rather, and then so on. So we're typically pulling, depending on the size of the field, and it could be up to 8 zones on very large fields or fields with a lot of variability. But typically per zone, we're pulling about 20 samples. So you're looking 60 to 80 cores per field. So you're sampling the same points year after year. So you get a really good indication of what is going on across those zones. I don't know what you guys are doing, if you'd like to speak on that.
So I guess I use the same colors, but I only do 3 zones. Just because I used to work down in the Red River Valley, I would pull 25 or 2,000 fields, 200 to 2,500 fields a fall. So we didn't really want lots of different zones because it would take too long. And in those fields down there, it would depend. I mean, some of them we would just sample the dark green. It just depended on, luckily I worked for an agronomist or consultant that had been there 20 years already, and so he knew his fields in and out. By the time I left, working there for about 10 years, I knew those fields in and out, and I could look at our satellite imagery and go, okay, that makes sense. I can make my map like that. Nothing beats being out in a field, knowing the field and the land, versus sitting behind the desk and making a map. I don't know. I'm a boots on the ground person.
I get to do less of my own soil sampling now, and I miss it. I like soil sampling, but I think the guys get really sick of it by the end of November. So we sample low, medium, and high when it makes sense. This year, I've actually transitioned some of that to where we quit sampling the low producing zones and are doing maybe like a medium high, and then if there's a lot of waterway type parts of the field, maybe pulling that sample instead. So staying with 3 zones, but they may not include the lowest producing part of the field. And we kind of made that decision based on some economics of what it costs to do the zone sampling, and then at the end of the day, I'm not sure we were really using that low zone sample to make recommendations. It's ground you drive over. You put down less fertility there, but how much less is maybe, we decided we weren't using that data the way we could, and it didn't represent enough acres. So we've been, the program we've used in the past has been a low, medium, high. We do our fertilizer applications with more zones than that, but that's how our sampling was done. This year, we're getting involved with, a lot of you guys may have heard of SWAT maps. There's another company called Field Reveal that does something similar. It's using more layers of data. And so we're using electrical conductivity to create that more precise data layer. And that program creates a lot more zones, like 9 zones in a field, but we're not sampling 9 zones. They did have a great explanation of why they thought we should sample 9 zones, and basically, so this will make sense to you guys, you'll like this. If your zone represents, say, 10 acres versus 800 acres, so like your field is a half section, right? Or it's a quarter or whatever. So if you have 9 zones in a half section, each of those zones is gonna be somewhere between 10 and maybe 40 acres, roughly. And so you start thinking about, okay, if you do 3 zones, low, medium, and high, the spread in nitrogen from the highest nitrogen containing zone to the lowest nitrogen containing zone, and this is AgVise data. So this data is from the lab that most of us use, represents the northern tier of states really well. So they said if you're doing 3 zones, your low to high zone, your difference in nitrogen might be, call it 20 pounds. And I'm not being precise, but it's a pretty small difference. But they said if you start sampling more zones, say 9 zones, you capture that difference better. So like with the question around pH, you capture that difference a lot better. So now in your field, maybe your lowest nitrogen zone has got 15 pounds of nitrogen left, but the zone with the highest amount of nitrogen left has 120 pounds left. It's because you've broke that field into more precise subfields that you get that better explanation of what's happening in the field. Maybe with phosphorus, we don't care that much. Maybe with nitrogen, we kind of care. But if we're going to start talking about lime, which is appallingly expensive when you truck it 800 miles, now we really need to know where to put it. And that's where I think I'm not ready to start sampling 9 zones. I'd never be done. But at the same time, when we're trying to be more precise on what we're doing with that data, that makes a lot of sense. And it's a good reason to start working toward better zones. And I have lots of growers that I would just like to get to doing zones. But for the guys that are going that direction, why do we need more precise zones? I think that's a great explanation of learning more about what's out there, and then how do we manage that?
So she makes a really great note at the end there, getting growers to do zones, period. I think that's step number 1. But step number 2, getting into these precise zones, you start to see some really cool things, and it changes how you visualize a field. Like, for instance, whenever we talk about a red zone or the low productivity zone, we don't, like if we're using imagery-based mapping right now and imagery alone, we don't know if that's a hilltop or if that's a slough or depression. It's just unproductive. No clarity on why. Where once we get more specific with using electrical conductivity and elevation data of a field, that's when you can really start to parse things out, where with these new kind of mapping techniques, the super dark greens, those are going to be your really low, probably borderline drown out areas year after year that are going to have higher EC values, be saltier, and your hilltops are going to be pretty much red all the time. So it's telling you there's a difference there, and you can see it in like zone sampling. If you're sampling red points, all of your red points, some of them might be in a low area if the map was made poorly. So you start, if that happens and your operator in the field doesn't catch it, you're mixing samples with maybe a slough from a hilltop, and that screws everything up. You're not any closer. So it's just another further iteration of how we can be better and more effectively manage every zone in a field. So I'm obviously very passionate about this, but that's my 2 cents.
Okay, I have a question. Who has all seen a zone map made of a field? Okay, so this was my learning experience on zone maps for East River versus West River. East River, those red areas were in the low spots, like where the water pooled in the fields. So when I came out here and first started sampling, I kind of followed the rules that were out there until I found out when I did a field where I could zone it and see, I was like, hey, the green parts, the good productive parts of these fields are down in the low spots. So it was absolutely flipped from, how I thought it should be. And that's one of those things to, watch, that's learning. Yeah, low spots, bad down there, good here.
I think that's a great point to make on who you're working with. It's like, I think we all see the sales data from people that are like, oh, this old zone program didn't work. See, we can make a better map. It's really about, this was a bad map. Whoever made this map didn't do the homework, or the grower didn't work with them, because there's a lot of back and forth as we get these maps set up. So bad maps exist, but they exist because either the agronomist or the grower isn't doing the work to truth them. as we move to better quality maps, it still takes a person that knows that ground. I work from the state line, from the Montana-North Dakota state line, clear out to Scobie. Those are very different soils and very different rainfalls. Bottineau to the state line from the other direction is very different. So if you're working with an agronomist that knows your area and works with you to sort that out as you develop those maps, there's nothing like spending the money on all of this to get bad maps. And then you put it in your drill and your seeding and you're watching the rates vary and you're thinking, I could have done better than that with the up-down button. That is bad maps, but it's not to say that zones aren't working. It's that we need data, but we also just have to have a person who's local enough to understand you and your soils. It's one of those things that a few years ago, there was all these like national tech companies that were gonna replace people. And it doesn't take very long, even with like EC data, elevation, I can still make bad maps if I don't go out and truth them and work with the growers to truth them. You want us to talk about sulfur? We only have 4 minutes. Elston is the master at sulfur. I think I'll give just a short why I think sulfur gets neglected. With canola, right, that's a different critter. Canola needs sulfur, and I would say all oil seeds need sulfur. In the rest of our crops, for one thing, it's not very, the sulfurous soil test, as it's been explained to me, is only useful when it's really low, which sounds like a sales pitch and you guys love when we say these things. But when it's really low, it truly is really low, there is none. But as soon as it starts showing moderate to high levels, it probably means you picked up a chunk of sulfur containing rock in your sample. And that sounds like a sales pitch. So that's always a hard sell. Like, hey, this looks really good, you should probably put sulfur on this. So that's, part of it is when you guys look at soil tests, lots of times it's unpredictable and it's higher than maybe the plants across the field see. So I think that's a piece of it.
Dwayne, talk to me afterwards and I'll tell you about what the sulfur test and egg vice. I love egg vice, but truthfully, the sulfur test was the one they're like, yeah, whatever, it doesn't matter if it's high or low because it doesn't really predict anything. Couple years, maybe about 5-6 years ago, Dr. Franzen was on a big sulfur. Everywhere he went for a couple years, he was talking sulfur. Mainly that elemental sulfur was not the way to go. But it is a concern. We aren't getting the sulfur out of the air like we used to because of government regulations. But it is something we have to be aware of. And that's why I like using our phosphorus product because it has sulfur in it so that we do get it into the field because the levels are getting lower because we aren't getting it out of the air like we used to.
I think that's pretty well covered sulfur. Before we have a minute or so left. Anybody else have any remaining questions? Going once. Going twice. Sold. Thanks for showing up and thanks for listening to us.
Okay, this is just an entirely selfish one. Please come tell me to come look at your fields or something. I hate being in the office in the summer. I love working outside, so I like to scout fields. I like to sample the fields. I'm really good at getting you, after I scout, my findings back to you quickly so you can make your decisions. That's it.
Sarah speaks for all three of us. We love field time. We're all field nerds. I'm really glad to see you guys stayed awake. I'm pretty excited. We must have, soils are interesting today.
Well, with that, I think they deserve a big hand. Thank you.